Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the evening event. It's great to see you. I know you're not here for the comfortable seats, so thanks for turning out. I'm Khusro, curator of American art at the Princeton University Art Museum and co-curator of the exhibition Nature's Nation, American Art and Environment, which I hope you'll have a chance to come see at the reception which follows the conversation now. As many of you know, this was meant to take place in mid-November, and we were snowed out, so that was not ideal, but of course it's heartening to know that global warming isn't happening. In fact, the New York Times today just posted on its homepage that the Arctic has had its warmest 5 years in recorded history. So we know that it is in fact happening, and it's great that the people that we're going to be listening to today are actually doing something about that. Before introducing them, I'd like to just thank my colleagues at the Princeton Environmental Institute who are co-sponsoring this event and who have been really wonderful, steadfast partners throughout the whole exhibition and its associated programming. And I am very grateful to them for their support and for their enthusiasm for what has been, I think, a long unfurling road, and we're nearly at the end of it. The show is up until January 6th, so if you don't get there tonight, I hope you will before then. So this evening we're having a conversation with a couple of people who, as I say, are well known for their interest in environmental matters and their concern about where we're headed in that regard. I'll introduce them in turn. The person who will be asking the questions is Ashley Dawson. He's a professor of English at the CUNY Graduate Center and the College of Staten Island. He was here at Princeton just last year during the 17-18 academic year. He was the Curry C. and Thomas A. Barron Visiting Professor in the Environment and the Humanities at the Princeton Environmental Institute. He's the author of 2 recent books on environmental issues, Extreme Cities, The Peril and Promise of Urban Life in the Age of Climate Change, just last year, and the year before, Extinction, A Radical History, as well as 2 previous books on topics relating to race, imperialism, and literature. Ashley recently founded the Climate Action Lab, which brings together activists, researchers, and artists to reimagine climate politics through the lens of the city, and is currently at work on a book entitled Power to the People, Global Struggles for Energy, Democracy, and Just Transition. I suspect that his guest, his colleague on the stage, will really need no introduction, but I'm happy to tell you a few details of Naomi Klein's biography. She is, of course, an award-winning journalist, syndicated columnist, and author of the international bestsellers No Logo, The Shock Doctrine, This Changes Everything, No is Not Enough, and The Battle for Paradise. Her books have been translated in over 30 languages. She is senior correspondent for The Intercept, and recent articles have appeared in the New York Times, The New Yorker, The Boston Globe, The Guardian, The London Review of Books, and Le Monde. She is one of the organizers and authors of Canada's LEAP Manifesto, a blueprint for a rapid and justice-based transition off fossil fuels. The LEAP has been endorsed by over 200 organizations, tens of thousands of individuals, and has inspired similar climate justice initiatives around the world. She also is a member of the board of directors for climate action group 350.org, whose founder, some of you may have heard over at Richardson a couple of weeks ago. In 2016, that's Bill McKibben, of course. In 2016, she was awarded Australia's prestigious Sydney Peace Prize for, according to the prize jury, exposing the structural causes and responsibility for the climate crisis, for inspiring us to stand up locally, nationally, and internationally to demand a new agenda for sharing the planet that respects human rights and equality, and for reminding us of the power of authentic democracy to achieve transformative change and justice. In September 2018, she was named the inaugural Gloria Steinem Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies at Rutgers University. So it's nice to have her close by. Following the conversation between Ashley and Naomi, I'd like, as I say, to invite you all to the museum for a reception, and just note that you're going to have to transcend the, I won't say competing reception, but there's another one in progress in the lobby. You want to move beyond that into the museum itself. And on your way, purchase one of Naomi's books, because she'll be in the museum and happy to sign them for you. And I believe Ashley's books are on sale as well, and they're all great. As an added inducement to get you over there during the reception, there are student guides stationed throughout the exhibition, Nature's Nation, who will tell you a little bit about particular works in the show that they found of special interest to them. So without further ado, would you please welcome to the stage Ashley Dawson and Naomi Klein.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Carl, thank you very much for your introduction. And thanks also to PEI for inviting me back. I still have very fond memories of last year, and so it's really great to be back here again. And Naomi, it's such a delight and an honor to be on the stage with you. You've been such a vital voice for so many absolutely key movements for social justice and climate justice. So it's really wonderful to be talking to you tonight. So I thought that I would start with the bad news, and hopefully, although there's a lot of bad news, I'll watch the clock and make sure that we get to the good news at a certain point. And then we'll also have some time for questions that you may want to pose to us. So Naomi, in your book, This Changes Everything, one of the sort of central arguments that you make is that there was a particularly malign conjunction between climate change and neoliberal capitalism that made it very hard to address the environmental phenomena because of the ideologies which prevented people from thinking about what was happening. But unfortunately, things in some ways have gotten worse since then, and we're looking at this far-right surge. The damage being done by people like Trump and, of course, incoming Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro is pretty clear, the damage they're going to do to the environment. I thought it might be interesting to start off, though, by talking about how this far-right surge is connected to the environmental crisis and what some of the roots of the shift to the right might be in environmental issues.
Sure. First, I just want to say how happy I am to be here and thank everybody at Princeton, Carl in particular, for inviting me here and then inviting me here again. And also just urge any of you in the room who haven't seen Nature's Nation, which is just such an extraordinary exhibition, to make sure you see it before it closes, because we got a tour when I came here with Bill a little while back, and just really feel like it's such a thoughtful exploration of the intersection of the colonial story, really, of settler colonialism and the relationship with nature. In a really rare way, and I know lots of amazing things go on at Princeton that you can even take it for granted that this world-class exhibition is on your doorstep, but please don't miss it. And I'm also really thrilled, Ashley, to be in conversation with you. I was telling Ashley that his book, Extinction, A Radical History, it's in my bag, and it's filled with embarrassing notes and underlines because I deface books, but I'm going to get him to sign it for me later, and I really, really recommend it very highly. Because we often, what makes it a radical history is that it is a history of, much like the exhibition a history of a story about ecological collapse which intersects with the story of capitalism, of empire, of colonialism, and takes these events out of the story that we so often hear, which is that, you know, it's just human nature to destroy our home. We've always done it, we always will, there's nothing we can do about it, which puts us in a space of inevitability, because if it's just, you know, hardwired in our DNA and there's only one way to be human, then, you know, what hope do we have? So if we can see these as the results of systems that some humans have built and other humans have resisted and rejected throughout history, then it actually gives us a lot more power in these spaces. Your question about what we're seeing on the right, I mean, before I get into it, I would say that I believe that as frightening as what is happening on the right is, what is happening on the other side of the political spectrum is just as important and often doesn't get as much attention. And so I'm looking forward to talking about that with you, because, you know, when I wrote This Changes Everything, I think we were in a different political space in that the hold of neoliberalism on the imagination was stronger, and we didn't have this sort of new generation of political leaders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and then, you know, many people in the incoming congressional class who are, you know, really willing to put very bold, transformative ideas on the table that would have been unthinkable a decade ago, when the idea of a more planned economy, or, you know, even talking about a New Deal, a Green New Deal, would, you know, would have been a lot harder. So I say that before getting into some genuinely terrifying things that are happening politically. And politically, you know, terrifying on so many different fronts, and you know, so many are in the crosshairs. You know, whether it is, you know, migrant families being separated, or whether it's land defenders in Brazil who were already facing unprecedented attacks before Bolsonaro was elected, and now it's just kind of open season on anybody who is trying to protect the land in Brazil, or involved in land redistribution in Brazil. So, you know, you know, every one of these cases is different, you know, whether we're talking about Matteo Salvini in Italy, and this sort of de facto policy in much of Europe now to let migrants drown, you know, in the thousands, not to intercept boats. You know, this, I think, should be understood as part of the same trend, even if it doesn't have a face like a Bolsonaro or Duterte or a Modi or a Trump. We are, I think, seeing in many of these cases a similar kind of cocktail of this hyper nostalgia for a kind of simpler time when, you know, men were men and women were women and people knew their places. You know, we know this, we see this with Trump, but it's striking with Bolsonaro. I actually just had the chance to briefly interview Fernando Haddad, who ran against him and lost, who is the PT candidate in Brazil. And I asked him, you know, why he felt the results shifted so much in the last few days. And he said that it was the weaponization of gender more than anything else, that they were sending out tons and tons of like really kind of crazy fake news memes about, like some of them quoting Judith Butler, believe it or not, about basically all about how they're turning your kids trans, they're turning your kids gay. They call it gender ideology. So it was cultural Marxism. The war is on cultural Marxism, gender ideology, right? And they pinned this on Haddad because he had been the Secretary of Education in the PT government. So he came to stand for what was you know, this sex education going on in the schools that was supposedly turning your kids gay, right, or trans. And so it's this toxic cocktail, much of which is familiar in this country, and also the centrality of defending the fossil fuel sector, extractivism, right? I mean, this is such a key part of the Trump administration, which often doesn't get as much attention, but it is always worth remembering that he did appoint the CEO of Exxon to be his Secretary of State, who he now calls dumb as a rock. And it's, you know, the slippery slope where Tillerson comes to be seen as sort of the progressive in the Trump administration, right? This is how far gone. This is how much happens in 2 years, right? His first executive orders were to push through the Keystone XL pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline. I mean, it's a really central part of this administration, as it is for Bolsonaro, that it's just open season on the Amazon. So, I think that this is all part of a similar nostalgia that they're playing into. I think we also see commonalities around an internal and an external threat in all of these situations. Like, in Italy, it's the Roma inside that are the enemy, and the destruction of the Roma camps, settlements, and then the migrants at the border in the boats. Those are the twin enemies. And in the U.S., it's the mob, the specter of Chicago crime, which is obviously coded language about African Americans, and so that's the internal threat, and then the migrant invasion at the border. And then Bolsonaro, it's the crime in the favelas, and then the external threat is Venezuela, right? Which gets really weaponized in Brazil. So I think that we do see some commonalities, but that's not to say it's like a cookie cutter, it's the same everywhere, but they're definitely trading strategies, and that's what's really worrying, is this sort of cross-pollination that's happening on the right, with the sort of fake, use of fake news at the same time as casting journalists as fake news, some similar language increasingly around gender ideology, cultural Marxism, and also I think we need to understand how certain tech companies are developing surveillance tools within more repressive regimes, like what's happening now in India and China, and how those tools then migrate to the United States and more liberal societies. So I don't know if I answered it.
Let me sort of come at this in another way. Talked about a whole new generation of activists who we can look to and whose policies I hope we'll discuss. But I wonder if we can learn anything from the failures of centrist politicians and even of the left,
right,
in understanding why we have the kind of phenomena that you were describing. And in particular, I'm thinking about, for instance, in Latin America, the extent to which progressive governments relied on extraction, and the kind of commodity supercycle which Chinese growth helped to create. And now that that's over, right, the economic and environmental basis is sort of collapsing. There's a shift to the right. I mean, I know I'm sounding very vulgar Marxist here, but to a certain extent, the left played into, I think, perhaps a problem, because once that commodity boom is over, what do you do?
Right, I think that's absolutely true for Brazil, absolutely true for Venezuela. Also, I would say true for Bolivia and Ecuador. I mean, it's really worrying the extent to which these left governments have not challenged this fundamental logic of extraction-based, economics. And this is true for the left in general, right? That essentially we have been having a battle over the distribution of the spoils of extraction. Now there are exceptions to that, and certainly in more indigenous inspired movements, there have been other models put forward, particularly in Ecuador and Brazil, with rights of nature, in the Constitution, and much more of a discourse around respect for Mother Earth as being central. But economically, there really was not a diversification that happened, because I think of exactly what you're saying, that the commodity boom was just too tempting. That was fueled by Chinese growth. Commodity prices were very, very high, and it seemed for a time that it would make sense just to dig up as much, oil, gas in the case of Bolivia, oil in the case of Ecuador, and and other minerals, and redistribute the wealth. And you can understand the logic behind it. And the other thing that needs to be said is that a lot of these countries were given no choice, because they came to international forums like you know, the climate conferences like the one that's happening in Poland right now, came to the COPs, the Conference of the Parties within the UNFCCC, and said, we need a shared responsibility for the climate crisis that recognizes that the countries that have been emitting carbon at industrial scales for hundreds of years need to help those countries that are on the front lines of climate change to leapfrog to the next economy, to leapfrog over fossil fuels. You know, and Ecuador is a very interesting case where, under pressure from social movements in Ecuador, Correa came to the UN with a proposal to leave the oil in the Yasuni National Rainforest or National Park in the ground, because that is in the interest of all of humanity, in the same way that protecting the Brazilian Amazon is in the interest of all of humanity. We all need those trees, you know, to keep sequestering carbon, and we need that oil not to be, you know, turned into carbon pollution. And so they said, we will, you know, I think the proposal was, we'll cover 40% of the cost, but the rest of you, wealthy countries, have to cover 60%, and we'll create a fund, and it'll be a green just transition fund. And you know, they were completely rebuffed, right? I think Germany threw in a couple $1 million, but that was it. And so there have been attempts to get beyond extractivism, particularly, I would say, from Brazil and from Ecuador. And you know, so you know, when we say that they didn't get beyond extractivism, like, that is a shared responsibility, because it isn't as if there wasn't an attempt or there weren't proposals on the table. One thing I would say, though, in terms of how we end up in this case, in this interplay between, you know, collapse of neoliberalism and a failure of centrism, which I think is much more significant than the failure of the left, is the failure of center-left parties to provide real alternatives. I would argue that that is, you know, a big part of the reason of how we ended up with Trump. But if you look at what's happening in France right now, it's really interesting, because we have, you know, France is now in the 4th week of these riots, and in this sort of explosive growth of this movement that's calling itself the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests. It was sparked by a carbon tax, by Macron announcing that the centerpiece of his climate policy was going to be a tax on fuel, which hit working people the hardest. And people talk, you know, there was this one quote that really, I think, made it very, very clear what is, you know, exactly what the Macron government has done wrong. One of the protesters said, you know, those rich people, they can care about the end of the world, but we have to care about the end of the month, right? And so, you know, there's Macron. He has slashed taxes for the very wealthy, and is asking working people to bear the burden of the transition. It is the opposite of climate justice. It is a textbook case of climate injustice. And so now you have this uprising, and it's really up for grabs right now about whether it's going to go to the Front National, like whether it's going to go to the far right, whether they're going to harvest this discontent, because there's absolutely, like, racism in it, anti-migrant sentiment in it, but it's also, you know, a critique of, you know, Macron running what they call the government of the rich and so on. So which way does it go, right? And so I think we really see what a kind of knife edge we're on right now in looking at that movement.
Yeah, and I think those protests are really interesting, because they very much bring to the fore the way in which these climate issues also have to do with a much broader set of contradictions that are spatial, often racial, and gendered, right? I mean, you know, people can't afford to live in the center of cities in France, just as it's increasingly hard to live in the center of cities in the United States if you're not a billionaire, you know? So they've been pushed out to the peripheries. And often, you know, the people who live in the peripheries because of post-war migration there are people of color from former colonies. And so those are the people who have to drive, because they often don't have access to public transportation, who get hit hardest by the carbon tax. So yeah, that.
But I mean, that's an interesting point, because, you know, it's always struck me as, you know, one of the failures of our movement, of the climate movement, that we, you know, we talk so much about carbon taxes or cap and trade, or these policies that either feel completely abstract to people's lives or tangibly, are seen as increasing their daily costs, whether it's increased electricity costs or increased petrol costs. And something like public transit is just not really taken up as a climate solution, right? I mean, every time there's a smog crisis in Paris, which happens fairly often, right? A few times a year, the air quality in Paris gets so bad that it's, they have to do something about it. And what they do is they make the metro free, because that's what you do if you want people to use public transit. You make it free, And within a couple of days, the air gets better, lo and behold. I actually saw Bill de Blasio at the Sanders gathering the other day. Bernie Sanders had a gathering in Burlington, and the Sanders Institute. And I had a little chat with him, and he asked me, I probably shouldn't say this, but
Did you convince him to make New York City public transport free?
I told him, he was asking me what I thought would be, good climate policy, and I said, free public transit. And that was a really short conversation. No, but I do think that there are ways of financing it if we really embrace it as a climate policy, right? We're talking, I know we're gonna get to the Green New Deal, but what if really the centerpiece of the Green New Deal was, we were talking about, how do we retrofit some of those GM factories that are being closed so that they're making the best, public transit cars they possibly could, electric trains and buses and light rail, and what if the way it was funded was really designed to get people to use it, right, as opposed to creating these disincentives. So I don't know if it has to be 100% free, but I think it's a good opening negotiation position.
Yeah, I think it's great, and we're about to get another rise in New York City public transportation costs. So, there are big campaigns against it. So that would be wonderful. And the other thing, since we started talking about Green New Deal, that I think is worth talking about is that we are on the edge of, I think, another economic collapse, right? I mean, one can't be completely certain, but we're certainly due for one, and what the stock market has been doing suggests we're about to slide into one. I was just listening to an interview with Yanis Varoufakis, who was talking about what happened to him. He was the former finance minister in Greece, and he talked about when his Syriza government came into power, the fact that they were absolutely insistent on not drilling for oil in the Mediterranean. Mm-hmm. And then once the screws got put on and they accepted austerity, they also decided to start exploiting oil, right? So the way in which austerity means you have to cave in and have another round of fossil extraction. So
yeah, no, I mean, and I actually, when I was researching this changes everything, Syriza wasn't in power yet in Greece. They were the official opposition. They'd come very close. And I interviewed Alexis Tsipras for this documentary that my partner Avi made, This Changes Everything. And I talked to him about climate change and the idea that this could be the program for getting Greece out of recession, right? And creating jobs and improving services and the economic stimulus. And it was interesting because he's the reason that no is not enough is called No is Not Enough, because he told me no is enough at this point. He said, at this point, it's a time of rejection. We don't need to put forward that platform. And he said, Syriza used to be very focused on climate change, but since the crisis hit, people are worried about putting food on the table. You heard the same thing from Podemos in the same period, right? And so this is what has been, we've been on this boom-bust cycle with the climate movement now for many years, where you'll get a bunch of momentum. 2006, 2007, those were the key years, Inconvenient Truth, the Nobel Peace Prize goes to the IPCC. Everybody's, buying green products, open to a carbon tax of some kind of carbon pricing. And then the global financial crisis hits in 2008, and it's just off the table because responding to climate change was seen as a luxury, right? It was what you do if you had a little money left over, as opposed to something that is going to create the jobs you need, stimulate the economy in a time of crisis, and really a way out of an economic downturn. And so I think what's exciting about the Green New Deal framing is that it's recession-proof in a way that climate policies have not been in the past. In fact, we always get wiped out as soon as there's an economic downturn. And this is, I think, is quite, cleverly and importantly invoking the most famous economic stimulus of all time, right? Which, the New Deal was needed to try to get the U.S. out of depression. It didn't work. The ultimate, economic stimulus, which was the war effort, ended up getting the U.S. out of recession. But, I do think that that's a really important aspect of it, because I think you're right. I think there is going to be another economic downturn. And if we were to take the usual kind of so-called win-win climate strategy of, then I think it would be very, very vulnerable.
We talked about some of the elements of Green New Deal that are important, but I'd like to hear more thoughts about what you're excited about in relation to a Green New Deal, particularly around gender issues, which I think doesn't get discussed enough, but
Right.
is very important to highlight. And then, what some of your concerns are about that potential framing.
Yeah. Well, for those of you who aren't following this as closely, this is, it's a really interesting development, because during the midterms, there wasn't much talk of climate change. It seemed to be yet another election cycle that we were going to go through, and it would, barely merit a mention. But then immediately after the elections, this group called the Sunrise Movement, which is a youth-led climate group, who had been focused on getting politicians to sign a pledge not to take fossil fuel money. We've been doing this for a couple of years. Immediately occupied Nancy Pelosi's office and started calling for a Green New Deal. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, and this incoming group of much more progressive, some of them members of the DSA, incoming members of Congress, supported them openly. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has put forward this proposal to create a select committee that would be fully funded, be empowered to write legislation to come up with a plan for a Green New Deal. So there is no such thing as a Green New Deal at this stage. What there is a proposal to create a committee that would come up with a Green New Deal plan and then turn that into legislation, which is exciting because it means that if this were to happen, there's a year to try to shape that plan into being as enlightened as possible. And I think it would be very important to learn from the mistakes of the last New Deal and which sectors were systematically excluded, like African American workers on many fronts from the New Deal era programs, like domestic workers, like farm workers. This was also a period where I think 1 million Mexican immigrants were deported. And so knowing how a New Deal frame is not necessarily a just response, is not necessarily a just transition, even if you lose the discourse, what are the policies that would include and indeed prioritize some of the most oppressed workers in the economy and the communities that have gotten the worst deal under the extractive economy, right? So indigenous communities whose land has been torn up by fossil fuel extraction, urban communities who have the dirtiest industries in their backyards, whose kids have triple the rates of asthma and other respiratory illnesses related to pollution because of that. So what would it mean to take a just approach, which would say that the people who got the worst deal under the extractive economy should be the first in line to get the benefits of this transition, at the same time as making sure that no workers are left behind, that workers are included in designing the transition for their sectors. And so I think there's a lot of policy work that needs to be done. Luckily, there's lots of great people who've been thinking about this. The climate movement, even through this boom-bust cycle, I think to its enormous credit, and I guess it's something about sort of once you've wrapped your head around this, you can't kind of unwrap it. So, even when no politician or media outlet is talking about climate change, there's still an incredible infrastructure of, activists and scientists, and frontline organizations who are doing the work and pushing the debate forward, so that when a moment comes when suddenly it seems like we might be able to leap forward, we are so not starting from scratch, right? I mean, we have so much good work to draw on and best practices from around the world. So yeah, I think I feel like it's the first time that I can remember when there have been this number of politicians, not a critical mass yet, but I think they're at over 20 endorsers in Congress, who are ready to talk about responses to the climate crisis at the scale of the crisis, with the urgency that it demands. That hasn't happened before.
It's really massive. I wanted to ask you about your experience with the LEAP Manifesto and maybe some of the other work that you've done. What words of caution you might have for whoever is drafting this New Deal plan over the coming year. I think you've been involved with with the Los Angeles City Council in kind of declaring a climate emergency and using some of the ideas of the manifesto. So, at different scales, what lessons have you learned, and what kinds of intractable alliances have you found you could make in the course of doing this that might be useful for people?
Yeah. That's a great question. And yeah, we have the LEAP team has been working with a great coalition, LEAP LA, and they've been doing that very slow work of building trust and relationships. I mean, that's the most important thing, is people do need to get in rooms with each other and build trust between the environmental justice community and the mainstream climate community that have not taken leadership from the most impacted communities for a very long time, between labor and the environmental movement, between indigenous leaders and the environmental movement and the labor movement. There's a lot of there's a lot of history, and when we drafted the LEAP, we had great facilitation. Great facilitation is really, really important to kind of help groups of people who are carrying that history to feel heard, so that we can move forward. And that's a true art. And so we were really lucky to work with some amazing facilitators. I think you mentioned gender, and one thing I would say is that I think I would really like to see in these discussions about a Green New Deal is a much broader definition of what a green job is, of what a climate job is. Because right now when you hear that, you think of a guy in a hard hat putting up a solar panel or a wind turbine, and that is true. That is a low carbon job, and we need those jobs, and we can create so many more jobs in those sectors than just putting down another pipeline. But what that doesn't acknowledge is that there's a lot of low carbon work that is already being done, and that these tend to be the most denigrated sectors of our economy, and it's overwhelmingly work that's done by women, overwhelmingly women of color. So the care sectors in particular. Caregiving is low carbon work. It doesn't have to be bad work. It doesn't have to be a bad job. It can pay a living wage. And so we need to broaden that out. I mean, artists are low carbon workers, some of them, depending on how many times they go to the Biennale. And it's worth remembering that the New Deal invested hugely in the arts, right? And so what we should be thinking about, because there do need to be contractions in our economy, is what areas we can expand, right? And so that we can have, if we are going to need to contract some of our private consumption, what kind of public luxury, which is a phrase that's being used more and more, can we have, right? And that includes the arts, and that includes the work that strengthens communities. And so we need to valorize that work and pay and make it pay better. So I think that that's part of it. So I think one of the lessons that we learned with the LEAP is that we tend, when we build coalitions between green organizations and labor, we tend to prioritize the hardest sectors of the labor movement, right? Which are the ones with the most to lose. And I think that we should be working around the more intransigent parts of the labor movement who've been holding us in place for a long time. I'm not going to name any names here. But we just can't afford to do that. So we need to build coalitions of the willing. The nurses have been some of the most, the fiercest climate warriors in this country. We need to work with nurses. We need to work with teachers. We need to recognize that as low carbon work and work that we can expand, right? And make those jobs better paying. We need to, put climate justice in negotiations. One of the groups we've worked with in Canada, I'm looking for my husband, Avi Lewis, because he's the strategic director for the LEAP, and he does much more of this work than I actually do, but he's not here. He'll be here soon. But we worked with a postal workers union in Canada who were under a fierce attack where before we had our cute prime minister with the great socks, who buys pipelines, by the way. Before Trudeau, we had the Harper government, and the Harper government was introducing just a brutal austerity program, and part of this was they had announced that they were canceling mail delivery completely, so there would be no home delivery of mail. And so that's the kind of attack that the postal workers were under, and rather than do what most unions understandably do in a situation like that, which is just defend the status quo, they worked with us at the LEAP to come up with a plan to completely reimagine the post office as the hub of a justice-based transition off of fossil fuels. They put forward this vision called Delivering Community Power, where the post office not only has charging stations out front, solar panels on the roof, but is engaging in, is not only offering postal banking, but is offering loans for community-controlled renewable energy cooperatives, has a made-in-Canada electric fleet of vehicles, and they're not just delivering the mail, they're checking in on the elderly, they're delivering locally grown food, and so they're part of the caring economy. And it's really a visionary, transformational idea where, why should we cut up this institution and sell it for parts? There's a post office in every community. They're more ubiquitous than Tim Hortons donut shops, which those of you who've been to Canada know how ubiquitous that is. So, why sell off our public infrastructure when we could reimagine it and reinvent it and have it serve our most urgent needs as a society? And that's the kind of visioning, I think we need. And there are people in the labor movement who are thinking along these lines. And we've seen this from the teachers, right? They call it bargaining for the common good. They're not only bargaining for their salaries, they're bargaining for the good of their whole communities.
Time is for our conversation's almost up, and I know we wanted to talk a little bit about art, but I wanted to just ask one very quick question. What do you think about the idea of nationalizing fossil fuels?
Yeah.
I mean, you said Canada's prime minister to a certain extent has done that, but maybe
for
that's
all the
not
wrong,
the way we want
for all
to.
the wrong reasons. Those of you who don't know, there was huge resistance to a tar sands pipeline owned by Kinder Morgan, based in somewhere in Texas, and Kinder Morgan said that it was too risky a project because there was too much indigenous resistance, there was too much investor uncertainty, and in response to this, and also too much uncertainty because a new progressive government in British Columbia was challenging the project. So the Trudeau government stepped in and bought the pipeline off of Kinder Morgan so that they would take on the political risk with the goal of then privatizing it, right? So all the risk would be on the public, just like it is for climate change itself. But it was an extraordinary move for a government that positions itself as a climate leader on the world stage.
Given the short amount of time we have, can you imagine a government doing something like that, but with the explicit goal of winding down fossil fuels?
So I can. I can imagine all kinds of things. And obviously there are all kinds of moral hazards, right? I mean, when you have a state-owned oil sector, then the state is invested in the future of the oil sector. That's what happened with Venezuela. It's what happened with Saudi Arabia. So there's all kinds of examples of how not to do it. But if we look at, Norway, that's an interesting example. Not to hold Norway up as a perfect example, but they did have created, I don't know do you know what the size of the sovereign wealth fund in Norway is? Avi, do you know? It's huge. I think it's the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. And so one could absolutely imagine a model where that pool of money, which is public money because Norway's oil company is a public company or a publicly owned company even though it's traded on the stock market, becomes the seed money for the kind of Green New Deal that we need. But what I'm interested in these dying days of the fossil fuel sector is, I think we need to talk about how we get more, like the last remaining profits from that sector to pay for this transition, right? So the opposite of the Macron model, right, of like giving tax cuts to super consumers and getting working people to pay the costs. We need to, at the very least, hugely increase royalties for fossil fuel extraction and increase taxes on polluters and get a much larger slice of the remaining profits to pay for the transition. So I think there's different models. There's all kinds of risks associated with it. And I think the renewable sector, I think there are lots of great examples of cooperatively owned renewable energy. One of the things I think is, and you know more about this than me because you're writing, a book called Power to the People, but what's exciting about it is the idea that you can democratize your energy sector and you don't need either private or centrally controlled public utilities in the same way, right? You can have much more collective ownership, community ownership, decentralized ownership. So I definitely don't think we should replicate the models of public ownership in the fossil fuel sector, in the renewable sector. Yeah.
On that note, I think we should wind up and take some questions from the audience. So we'll take 3 questions at a time, and hopefully that'll allow us to get through quite a few. I think we've got at least one roving microphone or 2. A question back there. Shall we have applause?
Hi. Yeah. Thank you for the talk.
Too late.
So earlier you mentioned that in France at the moment, we don't really know which way it could swing between a Front National government or a Mélenchon government, for instance. It seems that in a lot of these situations, it ends up swinging to the right. And I wondered if you agreed that that was the case, why is there this asymmetry between the right and the left?
Sorry, there's a little bit of an audio problem. What?
There's an audio problem.
You can't hear me and Ashley? Just been sitting here nodding as if. Okay. You're very polite.
Do you want him to repeat?
Yeah, maybe hold the mic a little.
I think if you hold it like this.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. So you mentioned earlier about the election in France, or not to say the election, sorry. You don't really know which way it would swing between the right and the left. It seems in a lot of situations like that, it does end up swinging to the right. And I wondered, why do you think there is an asymmetry when it comes to battles where either side could potentially gain power?
Yeah.
First, thank you both for the work you've done and what you've written. I know so many people that have read your works and have come away with a deeper understanding and a renewed commitment to do something about that understanding. Fairly straightforward question for both of you. We've heard about one C word here, climate, but there's 2 other C words I think that I'm finding in the conversations a lot among activists. I've been to so many meetings, activist meetings, planning meetings, symposiums, and so on that I can't even remember them all. But the things that come up are, the other words are class and capitalism. And I haven't heard those mentioned here today, really, hardly at all. So the question for both of you is, do you think that we can build a socially just society and an environmentally just society within the confines of a capitalist system? And if you think we can, I'd like to hear how you think that's going to happen.
Okay. Is there one more question?
That's a great question, and I'd like to expand on that a little bit. Naomi, you mentioned, the government selling off assets, the Postal Service, et cetera. It seems to me that the design of our financial system, where we have to monetize everything, we have to monetize prisons, we have to monetize water. I used to pay, $40 a quarter for water. Now I'm paying $120 a month for water because the system has been privatized. So have either one of you given some thought to how we redesign our systems for the creation and distribution of money, to redesign capitalism, basically?
These questions.
Yes. Well, we'll both take a stab at it. I'll take a couple, and you can redesign capitalism.
I'll beat the cadaver once you've stabbed it to death.
It's so funny. I feel like it's such a sign of the times that we're getting called out for not talking enough about capitalism. Because when I published This Changes Everything, I got so much criticism from people because it's called Capitalism versus the Climate is the subtitle, and people would say to me, like, climate change is hard enough for us to tackle. Do you have to talk about capitalism all the time? You're alienating people and so on. And now it's just like, why aren't you talking more about capitalism? Which that's interesting. No, I mean, I do think we have to be talking about whether we can do the things that are necessary to do within a system that is built on infinite growth, and that defines crisis as any kind of contraction, right? That is a problem when confronting an ecological crisis. Climate change isn't the only ecological crisis we face, but it is ultimately about overconsumption. And the sort of neat capitalist solutions to this, which are often called decoupling, and it's possible to have growth, without depleting the planet. There isn't an economist on the planet that will tell you that it is possible to have the kind of reduction in fossil fuels that are necessary, according to the latest IPCC report, right? Where we're talking about 10 to 15% reduction in our emissions in wealthy countries like this through decoupling or anything like it, right? So we need a much more managed economy. I think it can be a mixed economy, and that I do think that there can be a role for markets within it, but it absolutely cannot be driven by markets. And so, I do think we are talking about a new model. When we have, we also are not talking about industrial socialism, because the two times when we have seen the most significant reductions in global emissions are when the global financial crisis hit and capitalism went into collapse. We saw emissions go down significantly. And the other time was when the Soviet Union collapsed. So what we know is that the planet likes it when both, industrial communism or whatever you want to call it, collapses, and also when capitalism collapses, right? So, because these are depletionary systems, right? So maybe we're talking about eco-socialism, maybe we're talking about something that doesn't have a name yet, but I do think we are talking about a different system than anything we've tried on a large scale yet. The question about why it always seems to go right. I mean, I think it's a great question. I don't think it always does go right. I mean, we've been giving examples in Latin America where it went left. In the cases where it has gone right, I mean, there often isn't a real left alternative on the ballot. There's often a sort of a soft centrism on the ballot or a perceived failure of the left. And there was certainly, but if we look at Brazil, I mean, that's a pretty extraordinary case because there was definitely a backlash against the PT, which had been in power for a long time. But the most popular politician in Brazil remains Lula, and he's in jail, right? So that was not in any way a fair election. So I don't think we can extrapolate from that the right necessarily wins. If you're willing to lock up the most powerful politician in order to win an election, you shouldn't really call that a democracy. So I think, what do you think, Ashley?
I'll try and be brief. I mean, capitalism is destroying the planet.
Yes, here.
I could stop there, but I'll say a little bit more. Capitalism is destroying the planet. It's not just climate change. I have a book on extinction, so we're also decimating all living species. And there are a whole series of other planetary boundaries that this economic system, which is based on ceaseless compound growth rates, are pushing us across. So we definitely can't keep going this way. And this is, I think, germane to our conversation. I think it was sort of woven subtly into everything we were discussing. Let me give you an example. The idea of a Green New Deal, of course, harks back to the original New Deal, but the notion was floated after the 2008 Great Recession by United Nations Environmental Program and Green parties in Europe, and the idea was a kind of environmental Keynesianism to get economies going again. Now, you don't want mass unemployment, so you want economies to go again to a certain extent, but you don't want ridiculous growth rates, right? So I think we have to be careful about how we think about and frame Green New Deal. And another one of the elements, although as Naomi pointed out, it's a kind of just a very brief thought experiment that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has created, and it needs to be filled out. But another one of the things that I think is somewhat problematic or potentially concerning is that it imagines a Green New Deal leading to US production of renewable energy technology that it'll be able to export. So it's sort of within a kind of inter-imperial competition, which is another really important element of capitalism. And we're seeing that inter-imperial tension stoked up in front of our eyes all the time. I mean, we're sliding from a trade war into increasing sounds of belligerent, military confrontation between the United States and China. So we need to be very clear about the dangers and try and head them off and make sure that as we contemplate a Green New Deal, that's not part of the package, I would say. So yeah, the short answer then has a longer set of considerations for how we imagine the future. And I totally agree with you, Naomi, that it's going to be about state control, but some form of as democratic as we can get it, and as connected to grassroots movement. But we really need to. We can't have local sort of horizontal movements making the change. We need to have a real massive transformation, and it has to be international rather than just within particular. Okay, can we do one more round of questions?
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I was at the regional convergence at Rutgers recently for the national, for the Network for Labor Sustainability, and it was very interesting to hear labor unions sort of discussing what their hesitations were about the Green New Deal and a just transition and vocalizing their concerns. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about what some of the skepticism or hesitation among other groups that we want to make sure are included in a just deal are. For example, precarious labor, people who are not included in labor unions, or indigenous communities, et cetera.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation. I wonder if you could possibly address the question of militarization, perhaps in two ways. One, the environmental catastrophe of militarization itself, and then the militarizing of environmental catastrophe. Thinking of the Pentagon as one of the largest single sources of climate catastrophe, and yet paradoxically they, more than many other entities, are onto climate change and have welcomed it as a bit of a silver lining and have said it's going to possibly extend the forever war forever. But then thinking about the ways in which environmental catastrophes like the BP oil spill, Standing Rock, the race to Alaska, the kinds of activism around environmental catastrophe is being militarized, even with something like the war games with the Northern Edge, and connecting it to also the carceral system, the ways in which prison workers have been put to work in environmental catastrophes like the recent fires in California. So my question is, can you talk about possible best strategies for combating the global militarization of environmental catastrophe?
Thank you so much for the talk. Just to say that hypothetically we don't make any political or social progress, what are the odds that some great technological innovation comes along and solves the problem of climate change? And just to play devil's advocate here, you mentioned how the French workers really care about what happens at the end of the month, and rather instead of what happens at the end of sort of the earth, so why should we care about climate change in terms of for the developing countries, the underdeveloped worlds? Why shouldn't we just make climate change an issue that rich people or rich countries worry about and they can discuss? And in those poorer regions, we have more urgent issues to care about. How would you respond to this opinion? Thank you.
Good questions. So your question about that sort of devil's advocate question, it's interesting because I've been at several of the UN climate summits. There's one going on right now, as I mentioned, in Poland. And it is the poorer countries who are always pushing for more ambitious action. Because they are most vulnerable. So pushing for a more ambitious temperature target, like committing not to allow temperature increases of more than 1.5 degrees as opposed to 2 degrees, right? It is always the wealthy countries who are saying, no, let's let it warm up more. And it is, the African delegates who will walk out en masse, for instance, as they did in 2009, calling it genocide, saying we will not die quietly. It's the low-lying Pacific Island nations that are pushing for a much more ambitious response. Absolutely an equity-based response, like what we were talking about earlier with an acknowledgement of our climate debts, that the countries, the UNFCCC has in its, founding mission that we have common but differentiated responsibility. That's the language. We all share responsibility for, stopping climate change because we all live on this planet, but we don't all have the same responsibility. The countries that have already reaped the benefits of fossil fuel and are much more, quote unquote developed, those countries are in a position now to subsidize poorer countries to be able to leapfrog over fossil fuels and get to clean energy. And there are absolutely urgent daily incentives in China, in India, where there's smog apocalypses, right, in major cities to do that now. And there's a lot of pressure on those governments to respond, not because of climate change, but because of air pollution, right, to leapfrog over coal and get to renewables quickly. So I think it's a good question, but in reality it plays out very, very differently. I guess the short answer to your question about whether we're going to be saved at the last minute by Elon Musk or somebody who's going to have come up with some laser beam that's going to lower the temperatures for us, I don't think so. I've spent a fair bit of time with the would-be geoengineers looking for those techno fixes, and the risks are so enormous. I mean, it's not anything I can summarize now, right? But the most sort of credible geoengineering model is what's called solar radiation management. solar radiation management, managing the rays of the sun. As William Gibson, the great science fiction writer, said about this, what could possibly go wrong? But we actually kind of know some of the things that can go wrong, because what they're trying to do is simulate a volcano, a very high altitude volcano, which sends fine particulate into the upper atmosphere to reflect more of the sun's rays back to space. And when that has happened historically, when there have been these very high altitude volcanoes, they have been accompanied by interruptions in the monsoon season in Asia and in Africa. And so it impacts the food and water supply for billions of people. So it really, really worries me, and this comes to your question, Anne, has to do with the weaponization of the ability for these technologies to be weaponized, so that a fear of crop failure in the United States is responded to by deploying some of these technologies, and this plays out by interrupting the summer monsoons for all of India, right? I mean, that is just terrifying. And then India does their own weaponized weather engineering in response. That's the kind of sci-fi scenarios that I worry about a lot. But even the most ardent advocates of geoengineering would not say it's going to save us. What they would say is that it could buy us a few years to come to our senses. So the question about other workers and precarious workers in the Green New Deal is a really great question. And part of it, part of the concern, I think, might be addressed by the sort of framing that I was putting out earlier about who is a green worker, who is a climate worker, and including some of the most precarious workers, particularly domestic workers, as part of this. Also the workers, the immigrant workers who clean up after hurricanes in places like Houston and New Orleans, and then face deportation. And this comes in to what was also mentioned, which is right now some of the most dangerous work responding to climate disasters is being done by the most vulnerable and least protected workers, whether it's migrant workers in the aftermath of hurricanes, who are the ones clearing away debris, who are the ones putting up blue tarps on roofs, or whether it's firefighters in California. A third of California's state firefighters are prison inmates who are paid $2 a day, $1 an hour when they're actively fighting fires. They do the most dangerous work because they're not allowed to operate the machines. So they're the ones who go in and clear the brush, right? So what we have, once again, is climate injustice alongside, Kim and Kanye hiring private firefighters to, protect their, gated community, right? So we, like Alfonso Cuarón talks about, and actually William Gibson says this too, versions of the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed, right? This is the plot of every sci-fi movie we've ever seen. And to bring this back to the role of art, I think one of the most important roles that artists can play is to help us imagine a future that doesn't look like this, right? Because we have imagined it so many times. We've imagined this future again and again, where there's this small group of super rich winners in the post-apocalyptic future where everybody else is like eating each other's brains or like locked out in some, massive global favela. Like, this is again and again and again. And the real problem is we actually can't imagine another future than that. Like, I think this genre of dystopian, fiction and, literature and film is well past the point of serving the original purpose, which is like to hold up to the mirror of society, a mirror to society and wake us up. And now it's actually playing more of a role of a kind of an inescapable self-fulfilling prophecy. And what we really need are different futurisms, right? We need, and I think we are seeing this in Afrofuturism and indigenous futurism and feminist futurism, but we need more of that, and we need that to have more of a platform as well. To help us imagine our way out of it, because I think that is maybe the biggest obstacle that we face. There's a great statement that was just released yesterday by a coalition of frontline environmental justice groups called the Climate Justice Alliance, CJA, and they just put out a cautious embrace of the Green New Deal with a lot of caveats about things that they're concerned about. And so I would really urge people to look it up. And I tweeted it out. If you're on Twitter, I tweeted it out today. You'll see it in my feed. It's really, really worth reading. You know, I mean, your question about militarization, I mean, I think what we are seeing at our borders, you know, on the Mexican border, you know, on the southern Mediterranean border, in Europe, in Australia with the, you know, Manus and Nauru camps, which are these island offshore detention centers. I think this is climate adaptation, you know. Whether or not the governments involved admit that climate change is happening or not, that what we are seeing is the way our society, if it is not transformed, will respond to climate change. And there is an understanding, even among climate-denying governments, that there's going to be more and more people on the move. There are already more people on the move than at any point since World War II. And so this fortressing of the border, and to me it was very, you know, telling that $10 million was taken from from the Department of Homeland Security that was dealing with disaster response and moved over to ICE, right? That was just a one-day story in the age of Trump, but I think a very telling one about what we're actually seeing. And so I do think we should understand it and, you know, analyze it as such as we try to develop alternatives, because we are responding to climate change. We're just responding to it with barbarism. Yeah.
Okay, I think
on that cheery note.
You also say we need lots of alternative futurism.
Yes, we do. I should have ended there.
So that's
bad planning.
That's a good note. I think we need to wind things up here, and we'll proceed over to the art gallery. So please join me in thanking you.
Thank you.